Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Missed Connections. Missed Connections is a Filipino romantic comedy that tells the story of May, the owner of a t-shirt business who's struggling to make sales of her products. One day while shopping for groceries, she encounters a man named Norman who she immediately becomes smitten with. Although she loses contact with him, May manages to find him again with the help of an app designed to help people find missed connections in public places. While the two get along with each other, Norman doesn't seem to reciprocate May's feelings, and numerous obstacles get in the way of the two, leading May to question if he's truly the one for her. This is about as average as it gets for a romantic comedy, which isn't really a bad thing, but not all that great either. It does some interesting things with its story, and the chemistry of the two leads, or lack thereof, is entertaining enough, but it's too ordinary and slow-paced to get excited about. May is an okay character, though parts of her aren't explored to their full potential. I like that she had an additional goal outside of the romance with regards to her t-shirt business, and it's nice to see her so active with it. She came across as a passionate character, which lends well to the romantic vibe of the movie. However, I found myself scratching my head at parts of her that went mostly unexplained. For example, she supposedly mourns the loss of her dad, but it's never explained what kind of impact he really had on her or what kind of connection he had to the rest of the story. It feels like it's mostly used to create artificial sympathy, which doesn't feel truly earned. In fact, she becomes less sympathetic as the story progresses due to her becoming increasingly more obsessed with Norman. This does have a point to it later on as she starts to realize certain things about herself and who she's become, but it was pretty hard to empathize with her in the beginning due to her behavior. The other character, Norman, was also a bit of a hit and miss for me. On one hand, his actor does a fantastic job at playing an oblivious geek who has a hard time recognizing romantic signals, but on the other hand, it's played up so much that he seems to lack energy, so at times he can be kind of boring. There's not much else to say about him as a character by himself other than this, which is disappointing. He doesn't have any agency of his own outside of the romantic entanglements he gets caught up in, which admittedly are fun to watch, but it isn't anything that no one hasn't seen before. The relationship between these two is where things start to get a bit more interesting. One person, being May, is totally head over heels in love, while the other, being Norman, couldn't really care less. The extreme opposite personalities between these two actually made for some of the best moments in the whole movie. May fawns over Norman so much that it's hilarious. Even the slightest, most normal thing that Norman does, like typing at a computer or just eating food, is enough to make May swoon. Add this to all the adorable banter they share with each other, and it's just a lot of fun to see them on screen together. It almost makes one believe that Norman really could fall in love with May, but the obstacles that May faces mixes things up even further. Norman is okay with just being friends with May, which isn't enough for her, so of course she strives and schemes various ways into trying to win his heart. Now in this regard, I like Norman's role as a more aloof type of love interest. His lack of interest in her forces May to escalate her antics, and no matter what she does, he just doesn't feel the same way. This keeps things between the two interesting, and it's one of the few things that separates it from other rom-coms where both love interests fall in love so easily with each other. In the end though, everything proceeds between May and Norman rather predictably. The movie has a bad habit of having May spell out every single thought she has to the audience, usually in bits of dialogue with her auntie. This tends to bog the movie down in a lot of unnecessary exposition and makes her character feel more generic. This gets further aggravated when she has conversations with the image of her ex-boyfriend, Mark. I appreciate the effort the filmmakers went into using Mark in such a way to flesh out May's backstory, but again, this tended to produce a lot of filler that wasn't needed for the movie. Logically speaking, it doesn't even make much sense. Norman never reacts to May whenever she's talking to the imaginary version of Mark, or even when she throws objects at him. Mark has some funny moments here and there, and he does have a point in representing May's failure to move on, but this is mostly lost amidst all the dialogue he has with her, so he felt like an unneeded distraction. On the flip side, Norman has his own subplot in the form of an additional love interest named Julia, an influencer who May really doesn't take a liking to. Once again, she doesn't take anything away from the movie with her presence as she injects some much needed conflict into the story, but as with Mark, she doesn't add much to it either. She's a generic social media mogul that doesn't have that much of a personality. It feels like Norman falls in love with her for her looks as opposed to who she is as a person, which could have been a good potential lesson for him to learn from, but unfortunately this isn't applied, so it just ends up being a basic love triangle. Outside of anything that occurs between May and Norman, there isn't much interesting that happens in the movie itself. Even with May hustling to promote her t-shirt business, it mostly consists of one or both of them sitting around and talking, which is fine to an extent, but not to the degree that's presented here. The gist is that May becomes obsessed with having Norman for herself and engages in increasingly harmful behavior to do this. I found myself mixed with this approach, because it is meant to teach May a lesson to avoid the toxicity she engages in and stay true to herself, but this also makes her character unlikable for a long time. And even when May is busy pining after Norman, the pacing remains pretty slow throughout the rest of the story, largely due to the ranty dialogue I mentioned earlier. This can make the movie very boring to watch at times, but it can also add to the movie too. In general, it has a chilled out vibe that fits well with the rom-com genre. The music is relaxing, and none of the characters are engaging in anything that could be considered exaggerated, which is a nice change of pace from the stupid slapstick stuff that appears in other rom-coms. The entitled. Speaking of which, the comedy as a whole is also fairly well done. Much of it comes from the banter May and Norman exchange with each other, but there's also little things like May's cat's behavior and Norman's trading card games that add to the fun while also complementing their characters at the same time. It ties everything together with a well-meaning but ultimately ordinary message about being yourself to attract someone you're into instead of trying to fit into someone else's mold. I like the sentiment behind it, but as with everything else in this movie, it isn't executed in any kind of way that could be considered even remotely novel. Overall, Misconnections is a decent but forgettable rom-com that's okay to watch, but that's about it. If you like rom-coms and want to watch one that's more relaxed and pacing without having to think too much about it, you might enjoy checking this out. For every part I like about this movie, there's something else related to it that hampers my enjoyment, so I pretty much found myself in the middle of the road with this one, and that's not always a bad place to be. For those who want to watch something more light and breezy, this is one connection you might not want to miss. What did you think about this movie? Did you enjoy the relationship portrayed between May and Norman, or did you find it boring instead? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Misconnections. Thanks for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it, and as always stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the Danish romantic drama, A Beautiful Life. Bye bye!